Good evening and welcome to the new school. My name is Gabriel Diaz and I'm the Rector of University Language Learning and Teaching, and it's my privilege and pleasure today to introduce our speaker today. Before that, I want to give a few thanks to our friends in Pearson. Rob Renner, you're here. He might be outside. Thank you very much for always supporting our events. My amazing team, Caitlin, Leslie, Stella, Jackie, and of course, our speaker today. And what can I say about Professor Thornbury? He doesn't need much of an introduction, but he's written some of the books that have directed our field for the past years. And we are very privileged to count him amongst not only our faculty in the MA TESOL program here at the new school as a founding faculty member, but also as our curriculum coordinator. So I cannot overstate what a pleasure it is to work with him on a weekly basis. And he's always been so generous to share everything he knows and he discovers all the time with us. So without further ado, let's see if it is terminal or not. Come on, Scott, thank you.
Thank you. Are we on air? We are. Thank you, Gabriel. That's very sweet of you, and it's great to see such a big crowd. And it's great to be in this auditorium. I've been working for the new school for 8 years, and they still hadn't let me give a talk in here. So finally, I'm here, and it's gratifying to see so many people here. But also, when I think back on all the kind of illustrious predecessors that have stood on this stage, it's quite overwhelming. We're going to have a talk for about an hour. I'm going to do my thing, and then we'll do a bit of Q&A, and then there's drinks and whatever outside at the end for further discussion. So the subject is fossilization, and it's kind of interesting. Well, first of all, I ought to say as a waiver that I'm not a researcher. I'm not really qualified to talk about fossilization. There's people in this audience who are much more qualified than I am. I'm looking for Elke, who've actually researched the topic. And in fact, this talk is going to be less a lecture than more a sort of an extended anecdote. So bear with me. But people like stories, and I hope that you'll find this one illuminating. And of course, the power of the story in terms as research is only as powerful as you're able to generalize from it. So I will try to draw some generalizations from my own experience and let you perhaps draw your own, particularly in relation to your teaching and your own students. So as I say, the topic is fossilization, and when it's very much still, I think, in the discourse of English language teachers, which we use the word fossilization or fossilized quite frequently to talk about our students. In fact, if you do a Google search of fossilization or fossilized errors, you'll find a lot of sites which purport to be dealing with this. It's obviously, it is a burning issue, and you get a lot of question and answer kind of stuff about what can we do with this issue. And that's what I really want to investigate today. And I'll paint in a little bit of background, but as I say, it's essentially a story. And this is the schema that I'm going to work my way through in the next hour. So a little bit of background. I moved to where I presently live, which is Spain, in 1986. And dare I say this, I was 34 at the time. You're all doing the math now, but I mean, it's important for the purposes of the story to situate me both in that context, living and working in Spain, and the age that I was, coming to Spain with no Spanish to speak of and very bad dress sense. So this is me, teacher training in International House Barcelona in 1986, plunged in, sort of airdropped into Spain, working around the clock, working on teacher training courses, and not having a great deal of time available to get to grips with the language. And as I say, I was 34. Now, I just heard, or somebody told me recently that apparently cognitive degeneration sets in at about age 41 on average. So that didn't give me a great window of opportunity to take advantage of. And So what did I do about it? Well, as I say, I mean, I was kind of very busy. My partner is an English speaker, so I didn't have the advantage of a lot of people I was working with who had arrived in Spain quite young, had kind of forged relationships and hung out in bars, and you'd done whatever that you do when you arrive in a new country at a tender age, and therefore picked up Spanish very quickly, or Catalan as the case may be. So what I did was I enrolled in some classes, found them of varying degrees of unsatisfactoriness, shall we say. And of course, nothing worse than being a language teacher yourself, to be a student in a classroom. It's a kind of teacher's great fear that there's another teacher planted there, because of course you're constantly one eye cocked on or assessing the methodology and finding it wanting. I mean, in all fairness, I mean, these teachers were doing the best they could with a very mixed bunch of people, but I remember very little from those classes. I remember one class, in the whole duration of that course, all I can actually remember was the sentence, "El payaso hace reír a la gente." The clown makes people laugh. Not a sentence that I had much opportunity to use. And then I re-enrolled in another class, which was more intensive, but because I kind of was able to sort of get my head around the level test, the placement test, being a teacher, I could kind of work out what they were getting at in this multiple choice placement test. They put me in a level far above what I was appropriate for me, so I did what most students don't do. Most students come to you and say, I want to go up a level. I was begging them to put me down a level because I was completely out of my depth. But those experiences were not entirely satisfactory because I didn't feel they were addressing my immediate needs or even my long-term needs as far as I could predict them. So it seemed to me to make more sense to find myself somebody who I could interact with on a one-to-one level, which I did. Found a student of mine who wanted, so the kind of what they call an intercambio, so we did half an hour of Spanish, half an hour of English, and that was great. I mean, that really did help to a large extent, especially, again, in terms of fluency, although he was a much better learner than I was and sort of left me way behind in terms of his English, and that was kind of a little bit humiliating, to say the least. So I moved from him to a circle of friends who I'd met at this stage, so it's kind of friends who were couples, one an English speaker, one a Spanish speaker or a Catalan speaker, and turned it into a social event. So stuff like that kept things kind of on the boil, but the fact of the matter was that I was it was very apparent quite soon that I'd kind of reached, quite prematurely, a ceiling. This wasn't helped by the fact that we're thinking 1986 here, and so I was heavily influenced at the time by the work of this man. This is a flattering portrait of him much younger. Debbie just tells me that he's about to speak at Tissot, France in November, and no prizes for guessing who it is. Who is it? Stephen Krashen. Now, Stephen Krashen, for those of you who are not part of this discipline, made a big mark in the late 70s, early 80s, mid-80s, and is still banging on about it, that there is a big distinction between learning and acquisition, and that languages are only acquired in the sense that we pick them up as we did our first language. And so this was kind of, at the time, fairly revolutionary, although he wasn't the first person in the history of language teaching to say this, that it's better to be exposed to the language and experience it firsthand. But what he was saying was that basically he made the clear distinction between classroom instruction, which is only so good, in fact, not very good at all in terms of long-term language acquisition. What you need to do is be exposed to comprehensible input. Comprehensible input. In other words, put yourself down in front of the television, go to movies, read books, read comic books, etc. Expose yourself to as much comprehensible input, and then magically, one day, suddenly you'll wake up speaking the language that you've been exposed to. So I did that. I thought, yeah, and I was a signed-up, card-carrying Krashenite at the time, like a lot of my contemporaries. And so I was heavily invested in the notion of comprehensible input. So I watched TV, and I went to the movies, and I tried to read some novels, and read some comic books, etc., and kept waiting and waiting and waiting. And years went by, and nothing happened. So Stephen, I'm sorry. And now he would say, of course, that he would cover himself and say that the input wasn't comprehensible, or it wasn't comprehensible enough, or my effective filter was coming down and inhibiting me from taking advantage of this lovely input. And he may well have been right. I mean, I wasn't a good, again, think 36, closing in on 40. I wasn't just going to hang out in bars talking to people about the Civil War, which is what the people who I'd met had learned their Spanish, talking to old people who had all the time in the world to talk about the past, etc. I just didn't have the time, I didn't have the inclination, and also I felt myself very frustrated in not being able to participate. One thing to be getting lots of comprehensible input, but if you're just sitting there paying for somebody else's drinks but actually not saying anything, then, the effective filter went up. So, I mean, you could say that, yes, it doesn't disprove his theory, but I'm certainly not as convinced as I was then that it's all about being exposed to comprehensible input. So time went on, and it became very apparent that I'd reached a kind of a ceiling. And of course, we see this in our own students, and this is why you get this discourse about fossilization, fossilized errors, etc. Because as teachers, we're constantly frustrated by the learners who have seemed to have reached that kind of, whatever you call it, intermediate plateau. I was forcibly reminded of this recently when I ran into the son of the portera, the concierge of the building that I had lived in when I first arrived. When I first arrived, he was 12. I ran into him a few months ago, and he was whatever he would be now, 40 or something, and we started talking, and he burst out laughing as soon as I started talking. He said, "Your Spanish hasn't changed at all." It's still that terrible British accent. And so I thought, thank you, Paco, thank you, that's what I need. Talk about effective filter, But anyway, so there you go. So I had living proof of the fact that I had reached this kind of point of no return, it seemed. So let's look at this concept of fossilization, what exactly it is, and what the research says, and what the history of the term is. And it was first coined in 1972 by Larry Selinker, and it describes that well-documented and intuitively plausible condition whereby learners stop learning. The internalized rule system stops, and it's not at the target level. It has features of interlanguage which mark the learner forever as a non-native speaker. Now, Rod Ellis, in his monumental study of second language acquisition, draws our attention to the fact in the second paragraph that this is still a controversial concept. And the question is there ever a complete cessation of learning? And hence the title of this talk, Is It Terminal? And this is, in a sense, what I wanted to prove to myself, that hopefully it was not. But just going back, looking at some of the evidence for fossilization in the literature, and there are a number of these case studies that were done around about the same period as Selinker coined this term, case studies of learners who seem to have fossilized. And two of them in particular who are now so famous in the literature, they might well belong to the SLA Hall of Fame, if there ever were one. And one was Alberto, and these are, of course, fictitious names. We don't have pictures of Alberto, but Alberto was a Costa Rican immigrant to New York in the 70s, age 30, mid-30s. And the researcher, John Schumann, who tracked his English over a period of 10 months, found noticeably absolutely zero change, or very little change in his English. And it was very much at a kind of very basic level. It was uninflected, there was no syntax, the negatives were all using no eat fish, no drink beer, whatever. And even at the attempts that Schumann made to teach him negation, for example, in English, or question forms, fell on deaf ears. And of course, Schumann concluded, famously, he didn't use the term fossilization, I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, Elke, but he did conclude that Alberto's English had kind of stopped simply because he was not acculturated. He did not form part of the target language culture. His friends, his acquaintances, his family, etc., are all Spanish speakers, and hence the acculturation theory, which argues that until you are acculturated, you will make no progress in the second language. So that was one of the first studies over a relatively long term and in relative detail of somebody's interlanguage, which had effectively fossilized. And the second one, of course, is Wes. Not long after, in 1983, Wes was, again, an immigrant to the United States, a speaker of Japanese who lived in Hawaii and was studied over a much longer period of about 3 years by Richard Schmidt. And in contrast to Alberto, and it is interesting to contrast them because we do have data of transcripts of what they actually said, Wes did show considerable progress over the period in which he was studied, and there was no instruction. I mean, that's important. Wes resisted instruction. He had bad experiences at school in Japan. He didn't want to go to classes. He was a professional. He was totally integrated into the target language society. He was acculturated. He was a professional. He was an artist. He had lots of English-speaking friends. But his English was almost at the same level as Alberto's. It was very, very basic. It was a kind of, if you like, a kind of almost a pigeonized variety of English. And however, what he was able to do, Wes, over this period of 3 years without instruction, was to make himself communicatively effective. In other words, he was able to maintain conversations even with the rudimentary means that he had. And therefore, unlike Alberto, he came across as a much more effective speaker of the target language. And interestingly enough, in a book that's just come out, or came out last year, a homage to Richard Schmidt and all the work he's done in our field, Richard Schmidt reflects on this seminal study that he did in 1983, and he asks this question, and I think it's very suggestive. He says, why do people think his English, Wes's English, is so good when he doesn't use prepositions, articles, plurals, and tense? In other words, totally unaffected, non-grammatical English. And he says, I think it's because when people talk to him and listen to him, they don't notice that he doesn't use them. They don't notice. He said, in fact, if you read in the original study, he says the only people who noticed or negatively rated Wes's English were teachers. Language teachers. They gave him like thumbs down, but anybody else who he had to deal with, they just didn't notice. And hence, of course, this feeds into Dick Schmidt's theory of noticing generally, how important it is, both as a learner, but also as an interlocutor, it seems to be. And I thought that's kind of interesting. I will come back to Wes later on, but it's certainly the case that with my own Spanish, I had this feeling that when what wasn't helping was the fact that people didn't seem to notice that I was such a bad speaker of Spanish. In fact, often, because you're a speaker of Spanish, you're in the here and now, you can make yourself understood simply using pragmatics, using contextual information and clues, etc. A good case in point being something like this. This is the demonstrative system in Spanish. And I must have studied this at some point. I probably opened a grammar, and I did open grammars. And I looked at this page, and I thought, no way. This is the equivalent of this and that and these and those. We have 4 in English. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 15 there. So you inflected 3 different deictic directions, tenses, gender and plural. So a massively complicated system to kind of retrieve in the moment of speaking. Because when you think about it, you don't actually need these things in the moment of speaking. Just say one of them, whatever comes down off, the one that you reach up and comes off the shelf first. Because you're there, you're pointing, you're in the cake shop, you point, I want one of these, saying those, or I want one of that, saying feminine when it's masculine, etc. But who cares? They know what you want. They want your money. That's pragmatics. So there was no incentive. There was none of this feedback that I was getting of people saying, sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about. I mean, I was getting a lot of that too, but not in these grammatical areas didn't seem to matter. I mean, the feedback was probably, the people who were saying, I don't understand what you're talking about, was more at the level of vocabulary and pronunciation rather than the level of grammar. So grammar, like forget it. I mean, life is too short. I'm not going to be learning all these 15 on the off chance that I will one day want a plural neuter thing over there. So that, in a sense, kind of like looking back, helps explain why I was in a not dissimilar position from Wes. The question is, I guess, is it too late? Could I now, sitting down, studying these, knowing what I know, and being motivated as I am, and I'll go into that in a minute, could I get on top of this system, or is it irretrievable? Have I gone beyond it? Have I reached a point where a switch has flipped in my head, and there's no way now, because I'm relying on this kind of pigeon that I've developed, that there's no way that I can kind of jump-start it and start producing these kinds of things fluently. And again, looking at the literature on fossilization, moving on now, more recently, there's a lot of skepticism about whether, in fact, there is such a thing as terminal end state. And you think about it, after all, even in our first language, I mean, is there an end state? Do we stop learning? I mean, do we stop learning? Okay, we stop the grammar, I guess. By the age 9 or 10, it's pretty well intact, but we certainly don't stop learning vocabulary. So, I mean, clearly the brain is capable of taking on board and using more language. So people have been looking at this from a sort of dynamic systems point of view, seeing the mind as a complex system and language as being part of that system, and a socially situated complex system. I'm thinking of people like Diane Larson Freeman. Have drawn a big question mark over the idea that there is this thick end state, or that it's irrevocable, that you can't move beyond a certain point. And so she says in a recent book, any fossilized form, that is any grammatical error that seems to be fossilized, should be seen against the backdrop of the boundlessness of potentiality. I love this expression, the boundlessness of potentiality. This gives me hope. That is the hallmark of an open dynamic system. The system is open and dynamic, and it may not be moving very fast, but in nature there's no such thing as complete stasis. Complete, forever, irrevocable stasis. There's chaos, but there's always the chance of further complexity just around the corner. So this, in a sense, gives me hope, and it's led a lot of people who write about second language acquisition now to query the concept of fossilization, and a recent statement of that is Lourdes Ortega in a recent book on SLA saying, while it's an intuitive concept, we kind of recognize the fact that less learners do seem to stop, it's proved very difficult to pin down, and on the same theme, Michael Long, in a more recent book, says we don't have the evidence. Because after all, what evidence would you need to prove that somebody has stopped forever? I mean, how long do you have to track somebody? I mean, they tracked Wes for 3 years, but what's to say that 3.5 years later, things changed. The social situation changed. Maybe he decided to enroll in a class. Who knows? So is there a point where you can really say, yes, this person forever has stopped? And hence Ellis's proviso in that original quotation that it's a debatable concept. So what is now preferred is the less clinical term stabilization, or the less pejorative term stabilization. The stabilization is being used rather than fossilization to represent, yes, okay, it's kind of slowed down, it's stable, it's not moving, but it's not the end of the story. And so again, going back to Rod Ellis, it's true that many learners reach a point where they seem to plateau, but it's also true that many learners, or some learners at least, do reach a breakthrough point, or do report breakthroughs along the way. And I like to think of it, I mean, the term plateau is suggested, because I think, again, as teachers, we use this often. We talk about the intermediate plateau, and to visualize that in Spanish, and the word plateau is used to talk about language plateaus as the meseta is used in Spanish, and it's this idea of a plateau where a lot of people stop. There's the mountain up there, the Cima, but there's no way that they are likely to reach it. Looking outside the literature of language learning, it's kind of interesting to see that, in fact, the notion of a plateau is common across all sorts of skills. And in a very interesting article in the New York Times not that long ago, you might have heard of Jonathan Foer. He writes frequently in the New York Times. He's written a number of books. He's one of these kind of like highly motivated, very successful, very young, highly intelligent people who kind of drives himself. So he's the guy who, he was a reporter and he was investigating. They have this kind of memorizing kind of competition apparently every year somewhere in the States, and he went along this thing as a reporter and he was really impressed by these feats of memory that these people displayed as a competition. And so you have to remember a whole deck of cards and, you know, stuff like that. So he was so kind of like impressed by this, he decided, I can do this. So he went away for a year and he trained his memory, he came back next year, and what happened? He won. So, and his point is that we reach this kind of meseta, this plateau, this kind of, it's what he calls the okay plateau. We're okay. You know, we're okay driving, we're okay playing the guitar up to a certain level, we're okay speaking a language up to a certain level, but you can actually go beyond that, because actually what you're doing is functioning on autopilot. So he has a number of recommendations as to how you could go beyond the okay meseta and achieve the sema as he did. How? Well, one of the things to do is you kind of deconstruct the skill. You go right back to square one. You take it apart, and he draws on the literature about speed typing. Remember typing? I mean typists and how many words per second, etc. they're able to type. And he showed that you actually have to stop and go back and start to retrain right from the start. You can't build on your existing competence. You've got to deconstruct it, as it were. So, I mean, we're kind of familiar with that, I think, when we've had to relearn a skill like driving or whatever after a long time. So I was kind of intrigued by this, his experience. I thought, yes, well, if he can go beyond the okay plateau, maybe I can. There was also another issue, of course, that I haven't mentioned, but it was an issue of credibility. My professional job is totally invested in telling people how they should teach languages. So it's slightly galling to be in the situation where one of my students overhear me speaking Spanish and say, but you can't speak Spanish. You're telling us how to teach language. You don't know anything about it. So there was a huge kind of credibility issue here, which I keep putting off and putting off and putting off. I said, one day, I mean, it was my New Year's resolution for years. This year I'm going to do it, this year I'm going to do it, this year I'm going to do it. But for reasons I'll point out later on, there were a lot of blocks against actually effecting that resolve. However, last year, in May, I woke up with a start and decided, this is it. I've had enough. I'm going to do something about it. And I don't know what it was that triggered that. I can't trace back the exact train of events, but it was like, this is ridiculous. Let's do something about it. So first of all, I had to work out a strategy of what I was going to do about it. And this involved, the first thing was enrolling in a language class. I've got to go back to school. But also I was interested in treating the whole thing, in a sense, as a sort of self-initiated action research or whatever. I was kind of intrigued to see if it was possible to go from where I was to where I wanted to be, or like somewhere along that trajectory, and treat it as a kind of, as I say, a research project. So I needed, first of all, to diagnose what my level of Spanish was at the time. So I had a kind of, you know, what's it called, pre-test, and then do a post-test later on. So the diagnostic involved, I was thinking, well, how am I going to do this? How am I going to get a reliable measure of my Spanish quickly and easily, which I can then redo at the end of the process? Now, one thing, of course, is when you enroll in a language class, they give you a placement test, and that's what they did. I enrolled. The placement test was online, which had me worried straight away, because I thought, well, how can they test? It's the speaking that I'm worried about. You know, they can't just test my grammar. And it was a multiple choice, adaptive test, admittedly, so it adapted to where you how you answered the first questions. And it put me eventually into what in the Common European Framework is called C1, which is like closing in on, you know, C2 is the top. It starts oddly at A, and you work backwards up through whatever to C. But I was C1. They're putting me in the C1 class. And this is not really me. So I emailed them and said, I hope you're going to do an interview. And they said, yes, on the day that you come and we'll do an interview. So I said, fine. But this doesn't seem a very reliable test. So what I did was, I remembered a test I'd seen demonstrated at a conference I'd been to 2 years earlier, which is marketed by a well-known publisher who have their stand outside. And you can do it over the phone. And you might well be familiar with this test. It was called something else once, and now it's called something else, and I'm not going to advertise it, but I was just intrigued to see. I was impressed when I saw the presentation of this test, because I was kind of amazed, and the person who was presenting the test was a non-native speaker, and he had tried it on himself, and he said, yes, it's actually quite, he felt it gave a very reliable measure of his spoken competence. So again, it's a spoken test, which involves some of this. You do it over the phone, takes half an hour, costs $25. I did it. And this is the results that I got. Oh, there's the name. So it measures you on 4 different bands. Now, how it does this is kind of miraculous. It's data, big data kind of crunching. They have a massive database of other people who've done the test. You give them feedback afterwards about how reliable you think it was. This is all crunched. So what I came up with was, interestingly enough, it's out of 80, an overall score of 61, which represents blah, 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 blah. You can see it bigger here. They give you a kind of reading for how you score. And notice that there are 4 different bands, what they call sentence mastery, which seems to include grammar, syntax, etc. Vocabulary, and there were particular tasks that you did which seem to probe into the range, at least, of your vocabulary. There was fluency, and the fluency seemed to be measured by voice recognition software, I think, and sort of measuring pauses, etc., it seems to me, because you were asked to read things aloud and repeat things that you had heard. And then there was one section which you actually spoke spontaneously on a subject which they gave you. So they say, okay, now talk for 2 minutes about your daily routine, for example. So there was, it was as good as it gets over the phone, given there was no interlocutor. You get the result instantly. And pronunciation, which again probably being measured on, and you can choose whether you want, because it was in Spanish clearly, but you can choose if you want Latin American Spanish or Peninsular Spanish. So I did the test, and that's what I got. So I got this overall mark of 61, and I was kind of intrigued by it, not least because of the very high result in grammatical knowledge, and I'll come back to that shortly. So there I am. I've got I've done my pre-test. Next stage is back to school. They did get in touch with me in advance of the class and said, this is how language schools work, obviously private language schools. They said, oh, we don't actually have any other students for that C1 level. Do you mind going into B2, which is the next one down? I said, yeah, please, actually. Remembering my experience before, say, yeah, put me. But I thought, well, I'd rather be better in a class which is sort of below my, you see what I mean? It can be more motivating, and I don't want to be completely out of my depth. So they put me in, this is the class. Whoops. We've lost it. This is the, we're a mixed, it was an intensive class. I want to point that out. It was like 5 days a week of 4 hours, so 20 hours a week. So it was fairly full on. And we were, there we are, mixed nationality, all learning Spanish for various reasons, mixed ages. Well, no, not. They were all the same age. I was... They kept looking, what are you doing? Are you the janitor? I mean, so we had Koreans, Chinese, Japanese, Jordanian, Saudi, a good range of students of different abilities too, and they'd all, passed the test. Some of them being at the same school for some considerable time. Some of them, like me, were new arrivals. The teachers, and I had 3 teachers over the 2 weeks that I did this. 2 weeks, so 20 hours a week, 40 hours. I had 3 different teachers. They were all native speakers of Spanish. One was Argentinian, 2 were from Spain. That is immaterial, the fact they're native speakers. It wouldn't have mattered, but what was important was they were all experienced, and they had a fantastic command of the grammar. They knew every little bit about Spanish grammar. They'd been teaching for years, and they knew it inside out. So you felt you were in safe hands. They were operating from a curriculum which was based on a course book. The course book was standard. It was like anything. It was a Spanish version of the science things I was used to teaching English in. We covered in the 2 weeks, we covered 2 chapters in the book, which is kind of limiting, actually, when you think about it, because that was 2 topics, because they were topically, so one topic was cities of the world, another topic was television, like a whole week on television. And the grammar associated, the grammar was actually very, I remembered going back to these classes that I hadn't been happy with, and we'd spent a whole term on the subjunctive, and I knew that the subjunctive wasn't one of my priorities. But we're doing, and I couldn't believe it, we're doing the subjunctive again. Isn't there any other grammar in Spanish apart from the subjunctive? So I was kind of frustrated from that point of view. I felt that we were being sort of unnecessarily constrained by somebody else's decision about what was appropriate for us, both in terms of the topic, which dictated to a large extent the vocabulary, but also the grammar. But to their credit, these teachers were also, I think, frustrated by these constraints and were very happy to step outside it and to encourage us to kind of move beyond the immediate course book exercises. Or, if they didn't let us, we subverted the lessons by and it was really interesting, because it wasn't just me, it was the other students. So, we just want to talk. And so any opportunity that came up to kind of run with a conversational ball, as it were, we took up. And the teachers, bless them, were kind of prepared to run along with it. And thinking from their point of view, of course, they had 4 hours to prepare, so anything that kind of filled up some of the empty time would save them less preparation. They're very, very happy. Yeah, just talk about it. So what would happen was, we were doing an exercise on some arcane piece of grammar, and in the sentence that we were transmuting into whatever, into the subjunctive, there'd be a mention of the word dog, perro, and immediately would trigger a conversational topic. Somebody would say, the teacher might say, does anybody have a dog? Just because it's nothing to do with the exercise whatsoever, or whatever. And I would, of course, I have problems with dogs, and neighbors with dogs principally, so I would launch into one of my long anecdotes about how when I first ran the dog downstairs and all this kind of thing. I did notice after a while that the other students in the class, when I would launch into one of these things, would take out their cell phones and start he's going to run for another 20 minutes, so I can get some useful Facebook time in here. But the teachers were fantastic, because not only did they let us do that, but they provided us instant feedback on what we were saying and doing. They were strict kind of grammar, they were none of this, hands off. No, if you made a mistake, they were in there. But they had ways of doing it which were non-intrusive, that they didn't break the flow of the conversation. So I kind of really liked that, because I wasn't getting that out in the real world. None of my friends were correcting me, and maybe this was the problem, again, going back to the fossilization thing. So there I was, taking risks in the classroom, being fluent, and feeling good about it, not feeling threatened, no affective filter, if you like, and getting the kind of feedback that I had been missing for the last 25 years. Nevertheless, there were the drawbacks. There was a lot of wasted time. There was a lot of time spent on, as I say, these arcane pieces of grammar, and on talking about things that basically have no interest to any of us, unless we took, as I say, we kind of subverted the lesson. So my summing up of this experience, when I kept a blog about this, and I'll share the details with you at the end, and incidentally, the references that I've used are also available in the blog. I said that for me, summing up, the real benefit of these classes was the chance to be communicative within the safe climbing frame. Nice metaphor, yeah? So you can take risks, you can play around, but it's kind of safe. That the classroom dynamic offered, not just the teachers, of course, the other students. As soon as we started talking to each other and knowing each other and having coffees together, there was a dynamic that formed that was great. It was non-threatening. It was endlessly interesting. And so this was great, because I wasn't getting this in the real world. And so my conclusion then, what are classes good for? They're good places for incidental learning to occur, particularly the kind of incidental learning, because a lot of the learning was nothing to do with the syllabus or the curriculum that we were supposed to be working through. It was stuff that came up incidentally, because we took the initiative and because the teachers allowed it. So they're great places to rehearse, experiment, take risks, and getting at the point of need support. At the point of need support, when you need it. What's that? Fantastic. And one of the most inspired things that one of the teachers do, and on this topic we're doing cities of the world, which is, okay, next lesson you're going to do a presentation. Everybody's going to do a presentation about a city. You choose a city, you do a little presentation, 10 minutes to the rest of the class in Spanish. Wow. That really got me motivated. I sat up to midnight downloading slides, pictures of my hometown in New Zealand. Nobody had ever heard of it. And so there I was. I was doing what I usually do professionally, which was standing up in front of a group of people with a PowerPoint, but I was doing it in Spanish. Fantastic. And no, that really raised the bar. And not only that, then there were questions and answers. And the other students were really genuinely interested in this place. So it was a very, very interactive, highly challenging, but achievable. Achievable because of the classroom dynamic. The only thing I felt, and then of course the teacher at the end, she had a list of comments, feedback, etc., mistakes, which she then proceeded to go through. What she didn't do, unfortunately, and this is the teaching tip of the day, if you're doing presentations with the students, is you say, okay, now do it again. I want to do it again. I want to do it again. You've told me what was wrong. Give me a chance to do it again, please. Now, why don't teachers do that? Because they think everybody's going to be bored. But I don't think they would be. I think the other students could be involved in saying, okay, he's going to do it again, see if he does it any better. You've heard the feedback, see if he can incorporate those errors. I'd love to have a chance of doing it again. But that's the only thing that was missing. But it was a really... So I came out of those classes, and it's a truism to say that when you're immersed in the language classes, you come out thinking in the language. I came out really thinking and dreaming in Spanish. It gave me a huge boost. I remember coming back from one of these classes, and I saw a friend of mine, Spanish speaker, across the road. And I crossed the road to speak to her. I went across the road to speak to her in Spanish. I would never have done that before. I would have crossed the road to avoid speaking to her. And I was, so what are you on? I mean, it was amazing. So it was the confidence that came out of that experience, which was so, and it was the intensive experience. I have to say, sadly, that the literature on non-intensive, like, 2 or 3 times a week kind of lessons, is not very encouraging. Intensive is good. So if you're teaching intensively, that's fantastic. Some students don't have that choice, but I mean, ideally, if they can squeeze it into a short amount of time, so much the better. They will be more likely to feel the results quicker. Okay, so, however, 2 weeks is nothing. I mean, what am I going to do? Life resumed. This was the end of last summer. I had to go back to work, I had to travel. How was I going to maintain the momentum that those 2 weeks had given me? I had to rethink my strategy because it was quite clear that although I had this confidence, I was not anywhere near what I had envisaged. I thought, 2 weeks, maybe a month, it's all it'll take. I'll be over the plateau, I'll be climbing up the mountain. And it was clearly not the case. I clearly need to maintain it, but I also needed to rethink perhaps my goals because it was unrealistic to think that I could ever achieve native-like fluency or proficiency, accuracy. It's something I'd already realized, and I think thinking back, this was the block. This is why I had let it slip for all those years, because I'd reached a point, the OK plateau that Jonathan Foer talks about, where I was on autopilot. I could do what I had to do, but that was it. And I did a lot. I mean, I'm proud to think what I achieved in Spanish. But I also realized that to get any further, it was the kind of law of diminishing returns. If I had a vocabulary, for example, of, say, 10,000 words in Spanish, that would give me huge coverage of most texts. But it was still not enough to give me that extra edge on the kind of text that I might want to write, for example. So what was I going to have to do to get from 10,000 words to 15,000? Like a lot of work, a lot of memory work. And so I kind of figured this just wasn't worth it. And so looking at theories of motivation, it was interesting to see that in a sense I was functioning on a theory of motivation, which is sometimes called expectancy value theory. Expectancy value. You are motivated as a function of how much value you think you will get out of the effort you put into it. And I could put all the effort into the world in learning Spanish, but I was not going to get much in the way of dividends, really. It's the bang for the buck kind of theory. I needed another theory of motivation, I think, to get me motivated again, because that one was a kind of negative theory. I go, yeah, so what? And unfortunately, there's a theory around the corner, and one that's being talked about a lot recently, and you may well have come across it, and it's the notion of the ideal second language self. If you can kind of project yourself into some imaginary future where you see yourself as you want to be as the second language user, then that itself, that image, kind of draws you on. And it's attributed to Zoltan Durniai, who's written extensively and researched this topic. And that sort of, again, sums it up. If the person we would like to become speaks a second language, that's the person we want to become. And this is, again, a good, as a side note, well worth asking your learners, who is it from your language area, if you're a Spanish speaker or if you're a Thai speaker or if you're a Chinese speaker, who is it that you would like to be? Another Chinese speaker who has achieved an impressive degree, or as a sportsman or an actor or whatever, of competence in English. Maybe you should aspire to be like them. There's no point in aspiring to be like me, a native speaker. You're never going to get there, but you could aspire to be like someone like Javier Bardem, for example, if you're a speaker of Spanish. His English, or Penelope Cruz. So that's the theory. So this is, in a sense, I say, what is my ideal self? My ideal self, well, of course, the presentation that we did on our cities gave me a clue. I'm often asked to give workshops in Spanish to teachers of Spanish or to mixed groups, and I always say no, quite rightly, because I think, well, first of all, I don't feel my Spanish is up to giving workshops, and B, I'm not going to give it to teachers, because you know what teachers are like. They'll just be sitting there, think, oh my God, no subjunctive. But on the other hand, I have colleagues who do this, and I'm envious. I'm so envious of the fact that they can do it, and I can't. So I think if there is an ideal self that I could conceive, it's the professional self. It's the me giving presentations in Spanish. So this is me doing what I normally do, but doing it like this. So if I could get a bead on this image of my ideal self, maybe that would drive me on. But it meant, in a sense, reconfiguring the whole, the goals, the learning goals, making them much more specific. We're talking about Spanish for specific purposes. And narrowing the target to something which is, A, more realizable, but also, for that particular function, perfectly adequate. In other words, what I wanted was a kind of miniaturized version of Spanish, which was targeted at this particular register, if you like. And the literature, again, is very supportive in this area. A lot of work has been done on multilingualism is suggesting, yes, many bilinguals, multilinguals set their sights too high, but what is involved really in learning a language is not importing a great deal of knowledge about the whole system, but aligning one's resources to the needs of particular situations. And so, again, this seemed to make perfect sense to me. I needed to rethink. I needed to realize that, in fact, I was never going to reach the mountain peak. But nevertheless, I could achieve a lot from halfway up. In fact, the view from halfway up is just as good, really, and it's much more achievable. But I needed to develop some strategies. I needed to develop some strategies that would replace the classroom. And of course, the obvious one is to get lots of exposure through means which are cheap and affordable and portable, given the amount of traveling that I do. And clearly, one of them would be reading. So I was looked at the literature on reading to see what I could do that would help me read. But this is not to say I hadn't read anything until then. In fact, I had been reading Spanish from the day I arrived, being a voracious reader of newspapers and managing, more or less, from day one, because of all the cognates in Spanish, etc., and background knowledge, etc., to make sense of the newspaper. So I think, how much reading have I actually done over this period of time? So I did the math. I calculated how much, on average, I read of the daily newspaper in Spain, and I worked out, more or less, on a good day, I'll read something like 5,000 words of Spanish. Now, if you multiply that by a year, and let's say take a few days off, and when I'm not, but you get something like 1.5 million words of Spanish that I've been exposed to, and that's not counting any other reading I might be doing. So that's a lot of vocabulary, a lot more probably than many of our students do. So what would that represent in terms of vocabulary acquisition? What should I have learnt in terms of the words? Well, looking at the literature on reading, William Groby has researched this, and he calculates that if they know a good bulk of the number of words in the text, and so they can read fluently, they'll be exposed, nevertheless, if they read 1 million words, to 20,000 to 40,000 new words over a year. And if they learn only one word in 10, that will give them something between 2,000 and 4,000 new words. Now, I'd been doing this for 25 years, so technically I should have a vocabulary of 50,000 words, if this is true. 50,000 words, I mean, I don't have that many in English, but I mean, if this is true, how many words did I have? Well, how do you calculate how many words you have? You can do it in a sort of rough and ready way by simply going through a dictionary. This is what I did. I got a Spanish dictionary, and every 10th page, not every page, I mean, I'm not so geeky, but I went through every 10th page, and I ticked all the words that I could translate, that I recognized and I knew had a rough translation. And then I multiplied the result by 10, and I got something like 10,000 words. 10,000 words is not bad, but these are 10,000 recognition words, sight vocabulary. They were not part of my active vocabulary. But the point is, I'd done all this reading. Why should I read anymore when I was not getting any benefit from the reading? I mean, it wasn't. Either, it didn't seem to be increasing that much, and nor did it seem to be available for production. So something was not happening in the reading. You know, what was not happening? What was not happening was that I wasn't paying attention. I was just reading fluently, skipping all the words I didn't know, using context, background knowledge, reading. And also I was reading one register, like newspapers. I wasn't reading novels, I wasn't reading poetry, I wasn't reading plays, I wasn't reading comics, I was just reading. So it was very restricted. I needed to broaden my text type, and I needed to pay more attention to the words. I needed to focus on words, because all the literature says it's not enough just to be exposed to language. Pass it, crash it. You need to be paying attention and doing something with the words that you see. So, of course, looking words up in dictionaries is good, because the little physical effort of doing that helps. But even better is going back to those words, retrieving them from memory and testing yourself. And of course, now we have all this fabulous software available online, free, downloadable onto your cell phone. And I did that. And I used this program, and there are plenty of others. This is Anki. There's another one called Quizlet, which will allow you to make your own vocabulary cards. No student should be without this software. And then you just feed in all the vocabulary. I was using translation, but you could put images if you wanted. And notice that the words that I've chosen now are related directly to my field. They're not newspaper words. I decided, yes, if I'm going to be giving talks in Spanish, I need to get a massive upgrade in terms of my vocabulary about language teaching and methodology. So I went out and bought a whole lot of books in Spanish on methodology, and I just combed them for expressions like this, and I sat down and I did the work. So that was the attempt, at least, to go beyond simply extensive reading. And I think, again, those of you who are teaching, who've got students at that level, then certainly advise them to use this kind of software, because it is, as I say, it's free, and it works. I mean, it does work, but you have to apply yourself to it. Okay, I mean, the other thing was, this was all very well, but it was all passive, it was all receptive. You know, what I really lacked was, and which I experienced in the classroom, but how can you replicate that outside the classroom, is this crossing the street to talk to people, making opportunities to talk to people, engaging with people, and what's now called in the literature willingness to communicate. I was suffering from this kind of almost pathological fear of communicating because of all the negative experiences that I'd had. In fact, somebody said, it's not a teacher you need a shrink. And in fact, there is literature on silence and this is written from the perspective of psychoanalysis, this book, looking at silence in second language learning, a whole book about the subject I was immediately drawn to because it seemed to be my problems. Silence is symptomatic of a loss, ambivalence, and conflict that accompany transition between two languages, a psychical suspension between two souls. So, yeah, I can identify with that. Somebody said, to become a wit in a language, first you have to go through the stage of being a half-wit. And I didn't want to be a half-wit. I don't like being a half-wit, so I just bypassed that stage and not speak the language. I mean, so this was the problem. I needed opportunities to break through the silence thing. So I was looking at the literature on willingness to communicate. Willingness to communicate was first hypothesized as being a sort of something, you know, an innate character of certain learners. Some are more disposed to communicating than others. More recently, it's been seen much more fluid than that and perhaps negotiable. It's more a product of the situation that you're in rather than something that you carry around with you as a person. As somebody said more recently, willingness to communicate, it can only be enhanced and developed through the social processes and communicate. It takes two to tango. So I needed somebody to tango with. Looking back on the research again, going back to our case studies, you can see very clearly in the light of willingness to communicate theory, people like Alberto had no willingness to communicate because he didn't have to in English because he lived in this kind of bubble of Spanish speakers. But people have gone back to looking, and Bonnie Norton has researched and gone back to the evidence of that original study and looked at Alberto again and said, maybe it wasn't Alberto's fault. Maybe it was also the social context he was in didn't want him to communicate. He didn't give him permission to communicate. And she concluded that the reason why Alberto's language pigeonized was very simply because the members of the dominant Anglophone community had ambivalent attitudes towards Alberto, offering him limited opportunities to practice English rather than the reverse situations. It wasn't just his fault. It takes two to tango. They weren't giving him permission. And Bonnie Norton has studied migrant women in Canada and seen exactly the same syndrome, that those who are not given permission, who are not given membership, if you like, of this speech community, will always be on the periphery. Whereas Wes, remember the Japanese Wes, Dick Schmidt's Wes, was exactly the opposite. He seemed to have willingness to communicate despite the fact that he didn't have the means to communicate. And Dick Schmidt, again, look at the original study, says it seems that Wes's confidence, his willingness to communicate, and his persistence in communicating go a long way towards compensating for his grammatical accuracies. His persistence in wanting to communicate, again and again and again, kind of banging on that door until it opens, until he will understand me. And I think that was something that I felt that I needed to experience. How? Well, I could go back to the class, or I could go back to the kind of one-to-one situation which I'd experienced very early on. In fact, just by chance, a friend who happened to be following my blog, who wasn't a teacher, Spanish speaker, offered to say, well, let's get together every Tuesday evening on a local cafe and let's just talk. And it wasn't an intercambio. His English was perfect. We'll just do it in Spanish. Amazing, absolutely amazing. So this is not us, but it's from... it's a film I love and first saw in this city, My Dinner with Andre, and it's just a long, sustained conversation, but it's the beauty of conversation. So what we did was, this friend of mine, we sat and we just, glass of wine, talk, no particular agenda. He would sometimes give me feedback, he would help, but I'd keep notes, but there was not, there was no serious attempt at instruction. And I didn't want it. I made that very clear. It was just wonderful. I mean, I came away again, like those classes, just feeling full of the fluency that I had previously lacked. And the wonderful things came out of it, including this quotation from a Spanish writer, which I thought really summed it up, and he came up with that, but I was saying, you make it so much easier for me to talk, because you seem to be actually interested in what I'm saying, rather than how I say it. And he would actually say at the end of the conversation, I forgot you were speaking Spanish during that conversation. I just didn't even notice, because the content was so interesting. Now, that's an ideal situation. How can you replicate that in the classroom? Maybe you can't. But there are ways now, of course, that people can communicate with each other outside of classrooms through different media, and I think, again, if we can open up those opportunities to our students, so much the better. Interesting, subsequent to this experience, I did come across a book which was originally started as a blog and has been written to a book by one of these kind of self-styled polyglots. There's so many of them out there now on the internet, and they're saying how you should, and this is a guy who, without any previous training, learned a dozen languages fluently and talks about it and writes about it. And this is his book. And he's not a linguist, he's not a applied linguist, he's not a teacher or anything, he's just a self-styled polyglot. But he does say this, and I think this does ring true. We keep trying to find language solutions through courses, software that should be apps, flights abroad, books, schools, a host of other methods, some of which can be useful. But these are nothing but accessories to the true core of language learning, the people we speak with and hear. And I would add to that, not only the people we speak with and hear, as much as you can achieve stuff on the internet and doing Skype things, etc., one-to-ones, but it's the people in the room. It's the people that are across the table from you. It's the embodiment of learning, which I think is so important, the physicality, the fact that you're... And I think that's captured well in this quotation. Teaching the multilingual subject means teaching language as a living form experience and remembered bodily, physically. And that's a whole other theme, which I'm not going to explore now. But let's move on. Okay, so there I was. We're talking about 3 months now of this experience, the 2 weeks of the course, the reading, etc., various other things I'm trying, and these conversations. I was now ready to put this to the test, but how? I sort of facetiously mentioned on my blog that maybe I should give a talk in Spanish, and I got an email from a colleague who runs a language school in Barcelona that does workshops, and he said, you could do a workshop in Spanish at our school. We could get a very supportive audience of English teachers and Spanish ones too, and we could limit the size of the school if you want. You could get some feedback in the Spanish teaching too if you wanted. So there I was. I mean, you know, I couldn't say no. I mean, I was really back, I mean, and I'd given talks in this school before in English, so it wasn't a situation which was totally foreign to me. We're not talking about a talk like this. It was a group of, say, a dozen people in the room. So we scheduled this in. This was at the end of probably about November last year. So we're talking again, the whole thing has taken about 3 months to get me to this point. And I gave the talk. I mean, I gave the talk, but I just didn't give the talk. I rehearsed the talk, I practiced the talk, I found another friend who was able to put up with me. I went through this thing again and again and again. I wanted to do it without notes, etc. That itself was a bit, but it was doing the presentation about my city to the power of 1,000. It was the same, but it was the same process of doing the homework, getting it ready, practicing it, and then doing it. And I did it. And this is me doing it. And this is the, and look at them. And the best advice that my mentor gave me, it's a friend of mine who happens to be a language teacher herself, she said, listen, don't worry, just look at them. You know, eye contact, she says, eye contact, look at the ones who are smiling and nodding and like focus on them. And I was saying to Joe earlier, I want the lights up in the auditorium because I want to be focusing on people who smile and nod because, you know, it really helps. Because suddenly it becomes a social situation and it's not that different from across the table in the bar with my friend. That suddenly, yes, that's all it is. A talk is not a talk, it is talk, and talk is social. So once you tap into that, it makes it so much easier. So there I was, there they are, smiling and nodding, laughing at my mistakes, ha ha ha, no subjunctive. And, but I did it. It wasn't good, it wasn't perfect, it wasn't, but I did it. It was an enormous adrenaline rush. And I walked out of that classroom and I was this far off the ground because I did it. I'd found my ideal self. Now, it wasn't good. I mean, all sorts of things I'd like to go back and redo, but I did it. Now, okay, so post-test, yeah? So on the phone, back to Versant, do my little test again. Remember, this is how I came out first. What are you expecting to see? You want to see everything down this end? You know, big blue bar all the way? Well, two steps forward, one step back. That's language learning. But the good news is I moved from 61 to 63 overall, and that actually, fortuitously, took me into another band, the kind of C1 band. So I actually jumped at that little hurdle in terms of their descriptors. What's interesting is that sentence mastery kind of dropped. This is the grammar, the accuracy, dropped down. I always thought that was slightly unrealistic anyway the first time around. But look at the fluency. Now, it's still not good, but it's I did the math, it's 20% better in 3 months, 20% better. Slippage in sentence mastery, slippage in vocabulary, improvement in pronunciation. So what's going on here? What have I gained and what have I lost? I've gained fluency. I've gained fluency because I gained confidence. I lost accuracy, but maybe that's the trade-off. You can't have your cake and eat it as a language learner. And I'd rather have the cake. This metaphor's not working. But you know what I mean. I'd rather have the fluency, frankly. And I felt that I had got it. So what have I learned? Implications for teaching. First of all, I really do believe this, that it was the using and not the learning that contributed to the acquisition. And it's not what Krashen says. It wasn't just being exposed to it. It's actually using the language. Using it in the classroom, using it in the cafe, using it as much as possible. Using as learning. And as Brumford said, Christopher Brumford said, we may learn the tokens of the language formally, the tokens, the grammar, the vocabulary, but we learn the system by using it. We learn the system of listening, speaking, by listening, speaking, etc., writing and reading. The other thing is, we don't need to know it all. We don't need to know it all. I don't need to know everything there is to know about Spanish. We never know all. We never know anything we know our first language. So that's kind of salutary, I think. When we look at syllabuses and course books and exams, it's no, it's just not necessary. And not only that, we need to stop considering second and foreign languages as eternal learners on an interminable journey towards perfection. Perfection, no, forget it. Not possible, not realistic. Life is too short. And they're not learners. We need to think of them as users. And I was a user as soon as I entered that classroom. I was a user. I wanted to be a user. I made sure I was a user. Yeah? We want our students to be users as much as possible in the classroom. Not learning first and then using, but using and learning at the same time, because learning is using and using is learning. And therefore, as teachers, as educators, our goal might be better to develop resourcefulness, making the most of what they have. Even like Wes had no grammar, but he was resourceful because he was persistent. He had the willingness to communicate. So get rid of this notion of native-like competence. It's really relevant to very few of our learners, particularly in the EFL context. We might like to think of it then in terms of learning a second language is not a case of like having one home and then that's your first language, and then you get another home, and it's all together totally different. But it's more like taking what you can do in one language and sort of building an extension in the other language, but still basically it's the same edifice. It's taking what you can do and being resourceful with that extra. So finally then, to round it off, the great Henry Widdowson, I think, captures in a sense what I felt was my achievement, which is that you are proficient in a language to the extent that you possess it. You make it your own. You make it your own. I mean, that's the key. You bend it to your will. You assert yourself through it rather than simply submitting to the dictates of its form. By submitting to the dictates of its form, meaning, having to get it right. Having to get it right all the way through that long, long, long syllabus that's mapped out for us by curricula and course books or whatever. But making it your own and submitting it to your will. And I think that's, in a sense, what, in a tiny little way, I was able to achieve in those 3 months. So that is it. This is the website of this is the story. If you want to revisit that, if you haven't already seen it, the story. And that's also where the references are to this talk, which has gone on far too long. But on that note, I shall formally finish, and then we'll throw it over to questions before we go for drinks. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for joining me. So I think although we've overrun, Gabriel, we can take a few questions, and if you shout them out to me rather than we've run around with microphones, I will relay them back to the people who are filming so that they've got the questions or comments on record. So are there any? Yes, Marcella. Yeah, good question. So the question is how much correction was it? How much, in a sense, formal instructions were they getting? Very little. Very little. It was more like reformulating what I was trying to say if it wasn't really clear. And say, is this what you're trying to say? So it wasn't so much correction that says you got it wrong, or it was just filling in the gaps. I was just groping for a word, and he would plant it in. We did do, from time to time, more formal activities. I did this thing that Earl Stevick wrote about years ago, which is this activity which I would tell something to him, like an anecdote, something that happened to me today, and he would listen, and then he would tell the whole thing back in kind of grown-up Spanish, and then I would retell it back, and that way. And so each time I'd be picking up more things I'd try and incorporate. So again, this idea of repetition of tasks, which is very, very important. But no, there was no formal correction. I didn't want to put him on the spot and say, I want you to correct me, because he didn't feel that he was qualified to. But yeah, good question. Any others? Yeah.
This person says, what about the opposite result from what you showed? Like if somebody's been in class for 3 months and you know they're more fluent and they're graduating and yet the score is worse.
Yes, well, I mean, I would say with a huge health warning on these tests, with all respect to my friends from Pearson, and however clever they are just, I mean, what really in half an hour on a telephone can you do without an interlocutor? Can you really assess, and especially in terms of fluency, really? So it's all done with very clever algorithms and a massive database, admittedly. But I think we have to reserve a little bit of skepticism to the results. So, I mean, I felt, yeah, that's plausible, those results. A little bit disappointing, perhaps, in some respects. But I wouldn't, yeah, for my purposes, I didn't have anything better. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, also we have to accommodate the fact that learners get worse sometimes before they get better. I mean, this kind of, the U-shaped learning curve is very much better. And you saw it with my accuracy, that it's getting worse. Hopefully it will get better. So it depends where we catch them and which part of the U, I think. And so, but constant little testing along the way may be better than just like before and after. So we get a sense of that, yeah, it's messy, but it's going up. Any other, yeah, over there, the beard.
I really like what you're saying about everything related to fossilization, and it really opens my mind and reshapes it for myself, just for me as a teacher. And how much of this do you encourage teachers to actually share with their students and trying to get them to reshape their own idea as a student? And because it's kind of, and it can be eye-opening, especially for those that are maybe quieter or less kind of willing to participate, like, you know, pushing them to reshape their idea as students as well.
So the question is, yes, how much do we communicate this kind of knowledge we have about language learning in a sense to the students themselves? And I think, well, I mean, again, it depends a lot on the students, but I would say, yes, as much as possible. And I think it's actually quite good to share your own stories with students too, your own successes, but also your own failures. And they see that you're not the know-all, you know, that you have also experienced language learning yourself and the difficulties that are involved, and you sympathize with them. I think that's very important. But also, I think it's also very important to share your methodology and you explain why you're doing some things. I mean, a lot of students, it's a complete mystery why they're doing even things like pair and group work, which we take for granted. So I think absolutely, in itself, it becomes a topic of conversation, language learning. In fact, my cafe conversations with my friend, we spent a lot of time talking about language learning and language, because it's so inherently interesting and so problematic, but absolutely. I meant to just say, too, it's not an answer to your question, but you might be wondering what my teachers were thinking of me in my class and, you know, who I was and how I was. And I did keep myself anonymous. I actually changed my name so that I didn't, because it was a local language school in Barcelona, and I've been around it long enough, and I didn't want to sort of like, oh my God, that man who writes books is in the class. So I was pretending not to be who I invented a job for myself as a computer analyst or something. I mean, you know, hoping they wouldn't ask me any questions. But I actually, you know, but I would love to have shared with them some of my findings, not as a criticism, and say, look, I love what you did, but some of this other stuff I don't think really worked. But, you know, who am I to say? In the pink shirt, and then we'll go down the front, yeah. You. Oh, sorry, it's not pink, maroon.
I'm a little bit confused because my notion of fossilization is sort of like a language habit, if you will, that is difficult to break due to L1 translation or some other reason. But I like your analogy, well, your use of stabilization. But how does that relate to fossilization in the sense of the habits? I don't see the connection.
Yeah, I mean, the original, I think, formulation, and Elke, correct me if I'm wrong, of Selinkers was that, yes, that you reach, not necessarily, but possibly because of interference from L1, but you reach an interlanguage, and it's typical across a lot of learners, that they have the same kind of mistakes, and they reach the same, you can identify that stage of the interlanguage, and regardless of their L1 often, it's kind of, there were similarities, for example, between Alberto's and Wes's language, although they came from just two totally different language backgrounds. So yes, I mean, is fossilization the product, or is it the process in a sense? That's also been debated. Is it an ongoing, well, I think I'm reading you correctly, but yes, I certainly think this is part of the debate about the term, that nobody's really kind of nailed it down. Is it something that's describable in terms of an alternative system to the target system, which is just locked in? Or is it just a failure to, as somebody else said, is it just simply a failure to learn, full stop? And with a lot of things we don't learn perfectly. Is it just a natural process of kind of atrophication of skill development? Or is it something more psycholinguistic that can be described and predicted even? But the idea is being, actually just 2 years ago, I think at Columbia, they had a conference, Larry Selinker hosted a conference on interlanguage where a lot of leading lights in the field came back to revisit these topics in the light of what we know. And the book of that conference has just come out, published by John Benjamin. It's called Interlanguage, and it's well worth looking at. Diane Larson-Freeman was there. Yes, in the front row.
Hi, I'm just thinking about what you're saying in terms of the agency of the learner. You're saying that in the classroom you had 2 weeks with the best, the most positive experience was that you were there with the support, time on the point of need, and that you had to develop a sense of the willingness to communicate, and you had to internalize that yourself. And the way I see that is in terms of you're kind of looking as a learner, you build a sense of ownership or agency of your own learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm saying, if that's the case, then what does that mean for our teaching roles and or our teaching models?
It means a lot. It means that if you don't know, if the students themselves don't have a clear idea of what their aims are or their ideal relative self, it makes it very difficult. So I mean, and this is often the case if you're teaching EFL, teaching it in the, for younger learners who have no clear, it's just a subject in the curriculum. You know, what is your ideal? Although, I mean, given the global nature of English now and through social media and through popular culture, etc., it's not that difficult to tap into something that they might be able to identify with. But coming back to your question, the question was really about agency and how you inculcate a sense of agency and ownership in the process. And I think without going into too much detail, but I would say that where possible, where the content of the language classroom is oriented to the learner's own interests, even if you can't ascertain what their needs are. So, I mean, this is the problem with my textbook. When I wasn't really interested, we weren't interested in talking about television, for heaven's sake. But we might have been, had we given a chance to nominate the topics that we, particularly at the level that we were, the topics that we might be interested in. So it's giving them some kind of ownership of the topic, of the content of the lessons, and of the syllabus, perhaps, which is not always possible, because remember, we're working within a system which says, no, today is Tuesday, you have to teach the present perfect continuous. So it's not easy. There's no easy answer to that, but I think one way is to give them some say in the content, at least of the topics that come up. And doing things like the presentation, I mean, it's just such an obvious thing, but getting us up to do presentations was no big deal, but you could do that. You know, you don't have to be very advanced to be able to give a little, you know, just show and tell, or this is my family, or prepare a poster, or stuff like that. But it's about me, and I'm running the show for like all of 5 minutes. And that's a huge boost, I think, to a learner in a second language. And as soon as you can start introducing that, the better. Elka.
It's not so much a question but a comment, but I want really to commend you for doing the fossilization, thing, because that was an incredibly important part of the field to hear from somebody like you, because you're a native speaker of English, and it's because so many of the ideas coming to mention crushing, comprehensible input, and then this whole thing of just massive reading, and it's very important to hear what you share. You did that. You've been reading for years and years and years, and still you needed something. And so the more we hear from this, the better off we are as a profession. Particularly so many of our students who are multilingual and they found all kinds of languages. That's where we can see that, yes, this is comprehensively important but not necessary condition. And all of these things we emphasize these, but the one that has been really, you opened a great conversation.
And I would like to reinforce that by underlining the fact that whatever I've said about the classes I went to, I'm not meant to, they're not, I mean, the ultimate effect of them was positive. I mean, there were things I didn't like, things I would change, but the effect was positive. And I think this was very validating from my point of view. I invested the whole of my professional life in teaching people how to teach languages in classrooms. And you cannot get the situation always with somebody in a bar or whatever. So you've got to make the best of the classroom. But the classroom is actually a very good place for learning languages in many respects. There are maybe better places, but they're not available. So, I mean, and part of what works in the classroom is the focused attention to language. It was the feedback that she gave us. It was the grammar explanations, etc. I don't resent those for a second, but I like particularly the way they came up in response to our needs, not as a way of kind of, today, yeah, it's Tuesday, we're going to do the present perfect continuous, but you're struggling with this, stop. If you're struggling with ser and estar, we'll do a quick presentation of the difference, and then off we go again. But yes, classrooms work, focus on form works. It's really, really important, absolutely. And attention to vocabulary when you're reading also works, I think. Okay, we've got time for one more question or comment, and then I think we'll adjourn. Yes, Patrick.
Reassessment of learning styles instead of just your goals. Don't you think that as you progress in a language that you're learning in different ways?
Well, I'm not a learning styles person, I have to say, and that's a whole other... I think we carry around with us the baggage of all our previous education and exposure, and that, in a sense, dictates our style more than anything that's innate. I wouldn't say I was a kinesthetic learner or an audio learner or whatever. I have a very bad ear for languages. I know that's a fact, but I wouldn't say it's because I'm a verbal or visual learner. No, I have a very bad ear in English. I often have to ask people to write their name down because I missed it. So, and that's part of what has been identified as part of language learning aptitude generally. One is what's called phonemic coding ability, the ability to distinguish phonemes. The students have got it and they've got a good ear. They're often musical and they've got it. It's fantastic. It's a huge advantage. So I'd say things like that. Yeah, there are neurobiological factors coming. Where's Darius? Yes, we've had this communication over the email in the last week about, I didn't talk about neurobiological factors, etc., but they obviously play a part. And I'd rather think of them rather than learning styles per se, because I think the literature on learning styles is a little bit dodgy, to say the least. I talked about embodiment and physicality and the presence of another person in front of you. I think that's very important, but I don't think that makes me a kinesthetic learner or a haptic learner or a tactile learner necessarily. I do believe that, yes, we should engage as much as possible with a person's intellect and emotions in the language learning process as much as possible. That enriches the whole thing. So that's your answer to the question. But yes, I mean, when I look back on the whole experience, I see that there were moments when I felt particularly comfortable using the language and others when I didn't feel comfortable whatsoever. And you could attribute those perhaps to dispositions on my part, which could come from any number of reasons, but possibly learning style, yeah. Okay, so having shot Patrick down on learning style, I'll now call it a day. We'll adjourn, I think, to the patio next door. And thank you once again for coming along, and thank you for your attention.